Chapter 12. Scorpions Will Sting. The transition back to life in the UK would be made easier by the fact that my parents were in no rush to put me back in school. In fact, my mother had a much more important use for me. This use involved my labour, or specifically, the money this would generate. Having been the beneficiary of my labour previously, and with money still so tight, my mother saw an opportunity and began scouring the jobs column of our local newspaper. When at last she spotted an advertisement for casual staff for a new employment agency in the town, she encouraged me to give them a call. As we didn't have a phone, I ran to the telephone box down the road and gave them a call. Following the news from the agency that in order to register with them I had to show proof of age, I returned home somewhat crestfallen. Considering this no obstacle whatsoever, my mother hatched a plan. Rummaging through a carrier bag full of odds and sods, my mother produced a piece of paper folded into a perfect square and handed it to me. Upon opening the paper, I discovered it was the birth certificate of my deceased older brother Matthew. Having died 12 hours following his birth in January 1970, Matthew would have been 18 by the summer of 1988 had he lived. So, armed with my brother's birth certificate, I secured a job at the employment agency which specialised in supplying casual staff to hospitals and factories all over Kent. Purporting to be 3 years older than my actual age, on my first day I rocked up as Matthew Hills, aged 18. While my work with the agency continued throughout the summer, it would come to an abrupt end following our move to Boughton-Monchelsea, when we finally came to the attention of the authorities. Much like our move to Chestnut Drive 5 years before, following our latest move, I found myself once again drawing the short straw in terms of my bedroom. Indeed, the conservatory at Chestnut Drive was absolute luxury compared to the windowless store cupboard barely wide enough to accommodate the sun lounger on which I now slept. Unsurprisingly, despite the limited dimensions of my room, the amount I was expected to pay to my mother in rent remained the same. Meanwhile, for the first time in her life, at the age of 11, my younger sister would have her own room. For similar reasons to me, my parents would never completely take to Dee's new husband, Joe. At the risk of alienating his daughter, my father concealed his dislike from Dee. Furthermore, when she sought his consent as a 17-year-old to marry, he gave it unquestioningly. As for my mother, while initially she'd be charming and friendly to Joe's face, in the not-too-distant future, during an all-family showdown, she'd make her true feelings known. Before then, much to everybody's surprise, Dee learned she was pregnant. While Dee's response to learning of her condition could not have been more muted, I found myself tickled pink at the news. However, my delight would be short-lived when a couple of weeks later, Dee suffered a miscarriage. Similarly restrained in her response, Dee did not shed a tear, whereas I found myself inconsolable for her loss. As newlyweds who had just recently endured the pain of a failed pregnancy, their need for privacy was understandable. Yet the effect of the miscarriage was such that it further entrenched a tendency which began as soon as we moved. Following the event, Dee barely ventured out of her room except with Joe, who himself would only appear downstairs to cook their meals before returning to their room. While time would prove my mother's suspicion that her daughter may be being controlled to be true, I became resentful of the possibility and began to be openly antagonistic towards my new brother-in-law. With my resentment no doubt rooted in my own jealousy, I found my attitude towards Joe reinforced by my mother's assertions. Chief among them was her contention that the overuse of oil in the food Joe cooked Dee likely contributed to her miscarriage. Too naive to know otherwise, and only too willing to believe in his guilt, my snubbing and open criticism of Joe began to bring me into conflict with the other members of my family. Providing only temporary relief from the tempers which had begun to flare on all sides was an unexpected visit one morning from Maidstone Police. To the sound of my mother sliding back the door to my cupboard, daylight flooded in as I attempted to open my eyes. With great unease in her voice, she revealed that the police were downstairs and wanted to see me. Wondering what I'd done, apart from being a long-term truant from school, I got dressed and headed downstairs. Upon entering the living room, I found a detective opening a briefcase he'd set down on our coffee table. As I took a seat, I caught a glimpse of the registration card that I'd filled out for the employment agency among the contents of his briefcase. With my mother and I conveyed to Maidstone Police Station, Dad joined us not long after having been summoned from work. For the rest of the morning, the three of us were detained in separate cells and each interviewed in turn. Perhaps on account of my 16th birthday being just over 2 months away, the police decided not to prosecute my parents. Instead, they turned the whole matter over to social services. On a rainy October night, our social worker, Carol, arrived on our doorstep. Appearing to be in her mid to late 40s at the time, Carol's straight-talking approach appealed to me. Before I knew it, she had me sat down on my own in Sass's room, where she asked me to tell her about my life. Fearful of being taken away, I decided against retelling the whole sordid history in favour of more trifling matters, such as my father bursting into my room during petty arguments or telling me to turn my music down. However, had I known what was about to transpire, I might have thought more carefully before deciding against disclosing the truth. Having convened in the living room for a meeting with Carol, minus Sass and Joe, my father immediately took to the stage. When asked by Carol for a frank appraisal of the problem, all my father could offer in response was how I teased Dee mercilessly when we were younger and my current attitude towards Joe, followed by other petty examples of misbehaviour. Quite how my father thought these examples explained my ongoing absence from school was anybody's guess. Yet, to hear him reel off a catalogue of misdeeds on my part and cite these as the root of our family's ills, while ignoring both his and my mother's behaviour over the years, left me seething. As for Mum, as she had the most to lose should the truth come out, her silence was to be expected. Similarly, Dee remained conspicuously silent. Next, we went on to discuss the issues that I'd raised with Carol earlier. Addressing the matter of my father bursting into my room, Carol declared my bedroom to be my personal space and admonished him not to enter without knocking. His facial expression resembling that of a man who'd lost £1 and found a penny, this did not go down well with my father at all. Nevertheless, he opted to just sit there and take a ticking off. Moreover, sensing a complete lack of respect from any quarter in terms of our methods of communication, Carol cautioned us on the benefits of using more positive language as an alternative to swearing at each other. Lastly, having asked me to play some music on the living room hi-fi, Carol jumped up and went outside. While I turned the music up and down, Carol attempted to establish a volume upon which we could all agree and a level which could not be heard from outside. Having listed all the points to be adhered to, Carol advised she would draw up a family behaviour contract. Furthermore, sensing our collective need for relief, Carol offered me a weekend placement with a foster family in their home north of Maidstone. Alas, it would all prove to be a case of too little too late. In the weeks that followed, it would become all too clear that no family behaviour contract or offer of weekend respite could halt the direction in which we were headed, which was towards total family breakdown. Before then, and serving to compound matters, for the third time since leaving school 2 years before, I found myself back there once again. Despite my having completed no more than 3 months of schooling in that time, the decision was taken to return me to my former year. The fact that in 6 months' time my class would be sitting their GCSEs suggested that very little thought had been given to the matter. Undoubtedly, there was no way I could make up for the loss of 2 years' worth of education in just 6 months. Unsurprisingly, I began to struggle in every respect, and only the opportunity to rekindle my friendships with former classmates Justin and Simone kept me going. Indeed, it would be to the latter that I'd flee when the moment came one evening, following the inevitable family showdown, that I finally reached breaking point. As is so often the case, years of unresolved conflict is less likely to light the touch paper of confrontation as much something trivial. Well, that is how this particular evening at home began. What started with Mother and I falling out after she had accused me of making an international call on the family phone progressed to her making dinner for herself, Dad and Sass while excluding me. In the throes of me remonstrating with her, my father then threatened to stick one on me. As if this were not enough, when Dee and Joe appeared, my mother began tearing into her son-in-law for keeping Dee away from her family. Jumping to her husband's defence, Dee and Mum began physically fighting, following which I'd finally reached breaking point. Just then, in a moment of utter despair, I grabbed a sharp knife from the kitchen drawer and ran out of the house into the night. With no thought for where to go, I sobbed and stumbled my way through the dark for what seemed like an age. At that moment, I found myself on a footpath leading from Bourton-Monchelsea to Luce, the home village of my friends Nicola and Simone. With this particular path leading more or less to Simone's house, I headed there. Reluctant for my friend to see me in such an emotional state, upon reaching my destination, I chickened out and headed for the woods opposite her home. Having found a comfortable spot, I sat cross-legged on the ground and removed the knife from my coat pocket. While focusing on the blade, I reflected on the desperation that led to me grabbing the knife in the first place. But what now? Would I really be better off dead? If so, did I have the courage to go through with it? And what if I turned out to be wrong? Having rested my upturned left wrist on my leg, I contemplated all these questions. Despite my hopelessness, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Was there a way to achieve the same end without causing myself any physical pain? Having resolved upon absolutely nothing, I returned to my former state of despair. Just then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of Simone closing her bedroom curtains. Until I could devise a more pain-free alternative, I abandoned my plan and returned the knife to my pocket. Desperately in need of the comfort of my friend, I got up and ventured towards Simone's front door. Considering the lateness of the hour, it came as no surprise upon my knocking on Simone's door to see her father standing before me. Despite his somewhat forbidding air, which befitted his role as a police inspector, upon witnessing the state I was in, Simone's father spirited me up to his daughter's room with haste. No sooner had I sat next to Simone on her bed than the tears began to flow. Eventually, I stopped crying for long enough to tell her of the night's events before producing the knife from my pocket. After I handed the knife to Simone, she left the room momentarily, no doubt to update her father on what had happened. Considering my home that night to be far from a place of safety, Simone's father contacted social services. Before I knew it, I found myself in the back of his car en route to my respite placement on the other side of town. With it being after 11 p.m. by the time of our arrival at my foster placement, we were not surprised to find the house in total darkness. Deterred by the late hour from knocking on the door, Simone's father explained that he'd be taking me instead to a children's home on the outskirts of Maidstone. Upon our arrival at the children's home, with the exception of a single light shining from a downstairs window, we found the home similarly in darkness. With the home resembling a medical facility rather than a place where children lived, we ventured inside. In search of a member of the night staff, we passed an older teenage boy sitting in a TV lounge watching the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Having safely delivered me into the care of the night staff, Simone and her father left and returned home. Having become a notoriously poor sleeper, and despite the faint whiff of stale urine in the air of my room, I fell into a deep sleep that night. When I awoke the next morning, I would not do so alone. With news having got around overnight of a new arrival, the other residents decided to gather in my room. Upon opening my eyes, I was rather unpleasantly surprised to find a group of fearsome-looking boys standing around my bed. While some were dressed in full pajamas, others wore just the bottoms and were bare-chested. Yet there appeared to be not one friendly-looking face among them, and when the most muscular suddenly asked me if I was hard, I found myself lost for an answer. Unsure as to whether my response might give rise to the offer of a fight, I began to stutter. At that moment, one of the day staff, a lady by the name of Barbara, entered the room and told the boys to go and get washed and then come downstairs. Following breakfast, I met with Barbara in her office, where she announced that Carol would be coming over shortly to pick me up. From here, Carol intended to take me to my foster placement, where I'd remain on a longer-term basis. While my foster family were wholesome, sweet and kind, in fact, everything my parents were not, the prospect of remaining with them indefinitely filled me with dread. Despite knowing full well that my parents were the worst thing for me, I struggled with being forced to stay away from them against my will. While I'd been able to maintain a safe distance from them for most of the previous year in Malta, that had been my decision. Indeed, tough decisions are easier to live with where there is a choice involved. Incidentally, I'd remember well my own conflicted feelings during this time in my future employment as a residential social worker in a children's home. Like so many of the children for whom I'd provide care, I too began to abscond from my foster placement and head towards home. Before then, following my move into the foster placement, the decision was taken that I wouldn't have to return to school. Instead, social services consented to me finding a part-time job. Having been given the go-ahead, before long I found myself a seasonal post as a cashier in a popular newsagent's in the town's main shopping centre. Furthermore, with my mother having recently started working in a nearby employment agency, we began meeting up during our lunch hour. Voicing my struggles to her at having to live away from home, my mother echoed similar sentiments at the prospect of another woman parenting her son. Consequently, I began drifting back to Bourton-Monchelsea, where not everyone, specifically my father and Joe, would be pleased to see me. Predictably, with an interest to protect in keeping me away, my father made it known I wasn't welcome in the house. Being someone who always hated driving, in order to ensure my guaranteed departure, he'd cheerfully break his own convention by escorting me back to my foster placement personally, despite my protestations and tears. Events came to a head when, desperate to be in the last place I should be, I absconded back home one day. With the news that my foster family were on their way over to collect me, I absconded from my own home until they'd come and gone. That night, having been reported as a missing person, I squeezed under my younger sister's bed. Emerging the next morning in urine-soaked clothes, my mother decided enough was enough, and after contacting Carol, she confirmed to our social worker that she wanted me back in Bourton-Monchelsea. Following my return to the family home, I'd turned 16. With my presence casting a pall over Christmas 1988, come the new year, Dee and Joe moved out. As expected, my father blamed me. Desperate not to be outcast again, I knew the key to remaining at home lay in ensuring continued good relations with my mother. Therefore, it came as something of a surprise to find myself of a Sunday morning escorting my mother to the last place I'd expect to find anyone with such anti-religious views, the parish church. However, no sooner had I clapped eyes on the dashingly handsome vicar than I immediately understood the draw. With old habits dying hard, and despite the lack of reciprocation, my mother flirted shamelessly with the alluring man of the cloth. With his warmth and charisma, the vicar enjoyed great popularity among his parishioners, particularly my mother. Alas, with him being happily married, all her efforts were in vain, not that she'd allow such a trifling detail to prevent her from trying. Prior to Dee and Joe's departure, with the threat of school no longer hanging over my head, I secured my first legitimate full-time job as a cashier in the town centre branch of Safeway. Following receipt of my acceptance letter, which included the amount I would be paid, my mother demanded half my wages. Having resumed my place in my original digs, I felt aggrieved at having to part with half my wages on a room that was, in reality, a store cupboard. With neither of us capable of resolving disagreement with each other without descending into an argument, the inevitable fallout occurred one evening. While I stood in the dining room playing darts, my mother delivered the news of how much she expected me to pay. Considering her demand excessive, it didn't take much before she and I descended into a blazing row. Following this, in yet another display of misguided loyalty towards someone who had shown him absolutely none, my father weighed in and berated me for speaking to my mother in such a disgraceful manner. Having finally had a gutful of his pathetic devotion to her, and as resentful of the man who now stood before me as ever, for the first time I told my father to fuck off. No sooner had I done so than he made a move towards me as if to lash out. With this, I grabbed the handful of darts I had set down beside me on the breakfast bar and aimed them at him. Cautioning him to back the fuck off, with these words I glared at my father, whose eyes displayed the kind of fear he'd likely seen in mine each time he'd lashed out at both me and my mother. Just for once, I wanted him to feel the kind of fear from me that on countless occasions I'd felt from him. Realizing I'd finally lost my fear of him while he'd discovered his of me, My father retreated and went upstairs. After this latest incident, Dee and Joe moved out, following which I moved into their old room. Except to criticise me for the speed with which I'd taken Dee's place, to which I responded that with her room empty, he could hardly expect me to remain in the store cupboard, my father and I wouldn't speak to each other again for another month. Monday, 20th February 1989, to be precise. Before then, in what would turn out to be a fateful night, I'd enjoy a few weeks of relative peace in my new job. Yet, with the pattern of my life appearing to be set, a period of calm would often be followed by inevitable chaos. When the disruption came, a life would hang in the balance. As if fate were intervening to prove her wrong, a phrase used by my mother so often to belittle my father would finally come back to haunt her one night in an altogether unexpected and dramatic fashion.
Don't know what I'm doing here. They look alright to me. A typical example, lower middle class respectability. But scratch beneath the surface, look closer and I find that this young lad's in trouble. Gotta get into his mind. What's happening in this family? Things just ain't what they seem. A fur coat and no knickers disguised as a tangerine dream. In his room I talk to him. He's holding something back. Tells me that everything's cushy, a tough little nut to crack. The Reds, they cast their judgment, saying he's the one to blame. Absolve themselves of responsibility. Don't they feel no shame? What's happening in this family? Things just ain't what they seem. A fur coat and no knickers disguised as a tangerine dream. In him I sense a yearning to know what's true and just, for a place of care and safety, and boundaries a must. But what happens when he gets there? Will he embrace or just reject? Want back the only thing he knows, a place of no respect. What's happening in this family? Things just ain't what they seem. A fur coat and no knickers disguised as a tangerine dream. What's happening in this family? Things just ain't what they seem. All fur coat and no knickers disguised as a tangerine dream. A fur coat and no disguised as a tangerine dream.